Hello, boys and girls. Today we are going to learn about what happened in 1954 during the African American Civil Rights Movement. Brown versus the Board of Education. Courts declared that separate but equal schools were unconstitutional. Segregation means separation of racial groups. The 14th Amendment forbids states to restrict the basic rights of citizens and people. Desegregation was not welcomed by all, and so the National Guard had to get involved. It opened the gates for other groups of people to be desegregated also. Let's watch this video.
By the early 50s, segregation was frayed by the war and torn in spots where the court had acted. The white primary was outlawed. Housing covenants outlawed. Some graduate and law schools were forced to admit blacks. But the court was aware that the big fight was still to come. The schools, K through 12, white children and black in the same classroom.
Southerners assumed that if grade school kids were in a desegregated setting, they'd get to know each other and they'd get to date each other and then they'd marry each other. And that was the strongest taboo that the South held.
Led by Thurgood Marshall and other young lawyers like Robert Carter, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was running or aiding cases all over the country. The court picked 5 and consolidated them into one set of arguments, forever known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. As oral arguments approached, people camped outside the building to assure themselves a seat in the courtroom. NAACP lawyers Marshall and Carter were up against a formidable adversary, John W. Davis, a former presidential candidate making the last of his 140 appearances at the Supreme Court. But his arguments had a familiar ring. Separate wasn't necessarily unequal. Blacks should be happy with the way things were. Didn't states have the right to educate their children as they saw fit? When the 3 days of arguments were over, Davis was heard to remark, "I think we've got it won, 5-4, or maybe 6-3. The justices scheduled another hearing on the case. But before that could happen, Chief Justice Vincent died of a heart attack. President Eisenhower chose to nominate Earl Warren, formerly the governor of California. On May 17, 1954, there were signs. Some of the justices' wives showed up. Some clerks were tipped off. Then reporters rushed the courtroom.
Warren starts off in a bland manner, and you can't tell for a while as he's delivering the opinion what the outcome is going to be. And then he comes to the key line and he says, "And we unanimously hold that separate but equal has no place in the Constitution." And it was just electric in the courtroom when he said unanimous.
We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we unanimously hold that the plaintiffs are deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Plessy v. Ferguson in education is no more, and in practice, Plessy v. Ferguson itself is no more. The era of Jim Crow, constitutionally speaking, is over.
This was precisely what we urged them, almost in that language. So it was gratifying to have the opinion come down almost in the language of the argument that we made to them.
In 1951, I'd used a plain geometry book that had been used by a white student in 1935. Brown said that that was over. The hand-me-down tubas that I played in the high school band from the white high schools, it said to me that that was ended. And it said to me that at some point, I would not have to travel from Atlanta to Greencastle in Indiana to get an undergraduate degree. That my family, my cousins, my neighbors could go to Georgia Tech and to the University of Georgia. The Supreme Court decision of 1954 was for me the Magna Carta. It was the second emancipation. It was a great moment.
Education and discrimination had gone hand in hand in America since its inception. Most slaves were forbidden to read or write, and even once slavery had been abolished, the education offered to blacks was not equal to their white student counterparts. Only with the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, did things begin to change in the classroom, but it was not easy and it did not happen overnight. So let's talk about who was involved in the Brown versus Board of Education. Linda Brown was the daughter of the lead plaintiff, Oliver Brown, in Brown versus Board of Education. Linda lived in a neighborhood that was near a white school, but she had to ride a bus further away to go to a black school. In the summer of 1950, Oliver Brown attempted to enroll her in that neighborhood white school, but they denied her admission because of her race. And as a result, Linda Brown became the face of the struggle to end segregation in public schools. Lucinda Todd, she was a community activist in Topeka, Kansas, who fought for equal education. She was one of 13 plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education, and she served as the secretary to the Topeka chapter of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. One of the lawyers, Charles Scott, helped lead the plaintiffs of Brown versus Board of Education to victory, and he was influenced by his father, Elijah Scott, a prominent African-American lawyer in Topeka, to become a lawyer and fight for civil rights. And then, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he was a leader of the civil rights movement, and Dr. King helped organize a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in 1955. And 1 year after the Brown decision begins the civil rights movement to end segregation in all aspects of society. Let's take a look at the book Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka to get a better understanding. Segregation in the schools. Segregated schools were a particular problem. In many places, white schools had restrooms while African American schools had outhouses. White schools had buses and African American children walked to school. Most white schools had the best books and equipment their school districts could afford. The African American schools received used books and equipment. The NAACP went to court many times over the years demanding that schools be made equal. However, in 1950, the NAACP changed its goal. The organization would no longer fight for equal but segregated schools. Instead, it would work for integrated schools. When the Montan High School case went to a local court, the decision was in favor of the school district. The court said segregation was part of the accepted customs of Virginia. It found that segregation caused no harm for whites or African Americans. The NAACP appealed the case to the Supreme Court. The lawyer for the plaintiffs was Thurgood Marshall. Brown would become his most famous case. The case. 3 years after the Montan High School case, in 1954, the Supreme Court heard the combined cases of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. The cases came from 4 states and involved African American children trying to enroll in white schools. The school districts refused to accept the African American children since they were provided their own goals. The districts argued that segregation was legal. The parents of the African American children sued the school districts. The case was named Brown versus Board of Education for Oliver Brown. Brown was the father of Linda Brown Smith, one of the children who tried to enroll in a white school. The plaintiffs appealed each case to the next, highest court, until the appeals reached the Supreme Court. Most of the cases were originally filed in the early 1950s, but it took several years for the case to reach the highest court. Cases that are similar in nature and speak for many people are often combined into a lawsuit called a class action lawsuit. This was the case in Brown. The cases had been filed in 4 states and in Washington, D.C. The cases together represented all African American school children. The arguments. The arguments in the Brown case were based mainly on the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment guarantees all citizens equal protection under the law. In this case, the African American students and their parents were the plaintiffs. They argued that school segregation was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. The plaintiffs also argued that segregation was harmful to African American children because it negatively impacted their self-image. Let's go back and take a look at this. This is a chart about the different levels of how things go to court. So it's a flow chart. Brown versus Board of Education started in the local trial court, so it started here. The plaintiffs appealed to the next highest court, which would be the state. Then they appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So you would just keep moving up until you got to the U.S. Supreme Court. That is the highest court in the country. The school districts were the defendants in the Brown case. They argued that segregation did not harm students, African American or white. They argued further that school segregation was constitutional under the 14th Amendment because the amendment did not directly address education. The ruling. With these arguments presented, the Supreme Court needed to decide whether the 14th Amendment allowed or prohibited separate schools for African Americans and whites. There was one main question posed to the Supreme Court. Is the law used to separate children by race a violation of the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of equal protection under the law? The 9 Supreme Court justices did not agree amongst themselves at first. The case was first filed on February 28, 1951, and was not settled until May 17, 1954, 3 years later. The justices worked hard to come to a unanimous decision. They believed a unanimous decision would be better for the United States. Chief Justice Earl Warren encouraged the justices to make a unanimous decision. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that school segregation violated the U.S. Constitution and must be ended. This meant states and school districts were required to integrate their schools. The court also ruled that school segregation was harmful to African American children. It had been a long battle to achieve this outcome, but civil rights activists still had a lot of work to do before results would be felt at the local levels. Despite the claim that black students were equal to white students, they lacked the basic necessities for going to school. For example, in South Carolina, black children attended schools without running water, flushing toilets, or electricity. In one county, there was $149 spent per year on each white student, but only $43 spent on each black student. In Delaware, black students attended a poorly equipped one-room schoolhouse, while a well-equipped white school existed nearby. In Virginia, a black high school at the center of the case was overcrowded and was without a cafeteria or gym. The same was not true of the local white school. So in the 1950s, American segregation was largely, though not exclusively, a Southern practice. Every state in the South mandated school segregation, and 10 other states outside of the South either permitted or required segregation in public schools. Think about what it would be to live during this time period and how this decision that was made has affected the future.